we've got something exciting for you in the first part of the program today. We're going to go to Mount Everest, well, figuratively, if not literally, with someone who's been there and filmed it. Now, the context of this as well is all of the recent deaths at Everest because of an excess of people who the government of Nepal is allowing to climb to the summit. I think they issued 381 permits this year. This is double or triple what it's been in years earlier, and this is big bucks for Nepal. We'll get into that element as well. Christopher Coolish, a Boulder attorney, died just a couple of 3 weeks ago on his way down from the summit of Mount Everest. And you've heard about all of these people queuing up. You'll have 20 people online to go up and then to go down, waiting for their turn in a rarefied atmosphere where you need oxygen to survive and where you have a limited window, not just weather-wise, but a limited personal window regarding your own health and safety for making the ascent to the top and coming back down again. The summit at Everest is just over 29,000 feet. Think of two Colorado 14ers stacked one on top of another. That's how high it is. Alex Hart is going to be joining us. He's going to tell you about his personal experiences getting to the summit at Mount Everest and the documentary that he's put together about that. And having been there and back, he can also talk at great length about what's happening right now with the overcrowding of Everest. Let me bring Alex on right now. Alex, thank you for joining us today. And Alex is a friend of mine. We've known each other for years. You are how old now?
You know, a little bit younger than you, Mike.
You're younger than my daughters. 29 or so?
Yeah, we'll go with 29.
Okay, 29 is close enough for government work. You trained for more than a year. I mean, heavy-duty Ironman kind of training in order to get yourself in shape, and you were in pretty good shape to begin with for that climb.
Yeah, you know, I trained 7 days a week, 3 hours a day without exceptions. I stopped drinking. I stopped doing anything that was going to deviate from my training regimen prior to going to Everest. But then I also climbed other mountains prior to that. I climbed Denali, Aconcagua, and Mount Rainier, and some other peaks. So from the training side of things, though, you know, I had a pretty steady routine going throughout the whole week from Monday to Sunday and next week.
So you said you stopped drinking for a year?
Yep.
Weren't you concerned about getting dehydrated?
Well, yeah, exactly. Especially, you know what, I had to take advantage of that at base camp, at Everest Base Camp. I had my first drink, you know, from the time I left Colorado.
You're like a camel. That's amazing.
Absolutely. Got to store it somewhere.
All right. Tell us about your expedition.
Okay. So I was, my expedition was 52 days long. So you spend about 9 days to go from Lukla, which is the staging point, the village where you start from, at the middle part of the Khumbu Valley, where you then head up to Everest Base Camp, and that's about 9 days. And so you go to various villages along the way. You stop a couple times for acclimatization days, so your body gets accustomed to the increasing altitude. And then you get the base camp, which is 17,500 feet, and that's where you're going to be living that altitude or higher for 43 more days after that. And the climbing season takes place in April to June 1st. And so most teams show up around the first week or second week of April, and then they'll stay until the maximum point that they're either A, they summit, or there's no more weather opportunities to summit, or the permit kicks them off the mountain, which is June 1st. And so the reason why June 1st is the end of the season is because the monsoons start coming up out of India, and they push up into the Nepal, into the Himalayas, and then it just becomes impossible to climb the mountain with the amount of snowfall and the weather conditions. So June 1st, no matter what, you have to be off the mountain on the Nepalese side of things. And the reason why it took 43 days is because you don't just go to the top of the mountain. You have to let your body acclimatize to the altitude. So you have 3 rotations. The first 2 rotations, you're going up the mountain to adjust to the altitude. So the first one, you might go to Camp 1 at 19,700 feet, or to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet. And then you come all the way back down to base camp at 17,500 feet. The second rotation, you then try to get to Camp 3 at about 23,500 to 23,700 feet. And then that's the limit where your body is going to acclimatize. Any higher than that, it doesn't do you any benefit whatsoever to go up there, because your body can't produce any more red blood cells. You can't acclimatize anymore to that altitude. So you try to tag Camp 3 at 23.5, 23.7, then you come all the way back down to base camp. And then the third time is when you're actually going for the summit. And that's 100% dependent on weather. And the 2 main factors that come into play here are the jet stream which actually flies over the summit of Everest throughout much of the year, and the monsoon season that I mentioned earlier that starts to come up out of India. So usually what happens is the jet stream will move away from the summit of Everest somewhere between, the 9th and 12th of May, which will then allow people to try to go to the top. And then during that time, between the 9th and 12th of May, up into the end of May, you'll have X amount of possible weather windows or summit days, 7 to 10 on average. But the majority of all the summits actually that have taken place since 1953, when Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first climbed the mountain, have taken place between the 12th of May and the 25th, like clockwork. Just seems to be when the jet stream moves, seems to be when the pressure systems allow for some clear weather, and those are your chances to go up there. And so that's why it takes so long to climb Everest. But those are also the factors that then come into play, on the downside of what happened, for example, this year, that's getting a lot of publicity with 11 deaths that have taken place up there.
Now, your ascent to the summit wasn't just on a lark. This was for purposes of filming a documentary.
Yeah, actually, it's a documentary and a TV series combination project. So I went over there to kind of kill two birds with one stone. One was to live a childhood dream that I had since I was 14 years old, sitting on a couch in Omaha, Nebraska, saying I was going to climb Everest one day. And then the second one was because I was there to film this project called The Quest. And part of that project, I was there in Nepal for 63 days filming, and 52 of those days on Everest or during that expedition. And large part of that filming had to do with Mount Everest and the backstories of Everest and so on. So, so I was there to try to take care of two things at once.
Now, you didn't bring any tourists with you. You just had a team.
Yeah, correct.
And you were photographing it yourself.
Yes. So lower on down, we had multiple cameras. We had 7 cameras filming. Lower in the Kathmandu Valley, and then even up as we're going up in the Khumbu Valley. Then above base camp, because you have this really famous part of the feature of the mountain called the Khumbu Icefall, which a lot of people say is the deadliest 1 mile on Earth. And from base camp up, all the filming was done by me and 2 other people. So then the majority of the cameras and the gear and stuff stayed at base camp after that because of the logistics behind it. But we filmed it with multiple cameras and in different styles the rest of the way.
Now, I should disclose that I have been to the top of Mount Everest along with Dave Lauer, our producer. As a matter of fact, we were there this very afternoon just before we came on the air with Alex. Well, not exactly physically there, but you gave Dave and me this device to put on cover our eyes. What do we call that? Video kind of a
virtual
thing.
reality.
A virtual reality video
headset, yes.
Headset. Where if I turned my body 360 degrees, I could see 360 degrees. And if I looked up, I could see the peak of Everest. And if I looked down, I could see this crevasse falling thousands of feet. And I have to tell you honestly, and this was kind of 3D, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's fully immersive, yeah.
I got motion sickness. I really did. I didn't throw up, but my head was light. Is that common?
Well, it really depends on the person. Some people will take that VR, even like video games, the first person perspective will make them dizzy, will give them motion sickness, and others it doesn't affect so much. So what you got to see, you got to experience what it really looks like on Everest in 360 degrees. And so therefore I could see you start turning around and kind of, leaning back and grabbing, the window and so on. Yeah, for some people it has that effect, and for others it doesn't.
You should have given me an oxygen mask. I think I would have needed it.
And blown the wind, and then all of a sudden you would have had that full sensation.
Dave Lauer was literally screaming, gasping.
Yeah, it was great to see. And as a matter of fact, there's only a handful of people that have seen that footage, Mike, and it's great to see the response and the reaction. Because when you're sitting back and you guys are actually have the headset on, it's quite interesting to watch your responses and reactions to it.
I was amazed to hear that Hillary had climbed to the summit. I mean, she just ran for president a few years ago. I didn't know if she was in that kind of shape.
And she's maybe even now titled Sir Edmund Hillary, so it's no longer just...
Oh, it wasn't Hillary Clinton?
No.
Okay, I misunderstood. Excuse me. You are trying, and actually you're being sought after by some television networks and some other venues to get access to your film so they can use it. And it's not just about Everest. There's context here as well, because you kind of did a history on Nepal.
Yes. And mainly the rarely seen untold stories. Usually when you think Nepal, you think kind of two things. You think Mount Everest, of course, the most iconic landmark on Earth. And then you think maybe some mysticism, some Doctor Strange kind of stuff, right? But what you don't understand about Nepal, it's the birthplace of Buddhism, not India. It's actually a Hindu country, even though it's the birthplace of Buddhism. And you have this communist revolution that took place for 10 years, and you have all this other kind of stuff that goes on there that you don't really see much about, especially in the West. So the bigger purpose of the project is not just Mount Everest, and even the Mount Everest elements are a lot of the backstory stuff you don't see, the geological stuff, the environmental stuff, the political stuff, the economic impact of Everest and so on. But it's about the stuff that you don't see. So we give you the postcard, which is Everest, and that sense of adventure and a lot of, back to story context to it. And then we'll show you everything else off the postcards, what it has to do with about the country of Nepal. And that's what it's really all about.
So who's sniffing around for the broadcast rights to this?
So right now it's with an agency, actually. So the agency's handling it right now, and as soon as I know more, you'll know more. But, some of your usual suspects, will be approached.
National Geographic,
yes,
Discovery.
Those kind of people, Netflix and so on. So they'll all be talked to about this, and we'll see what ultimately happens. I don't have that answer yet, but we're working on it.
And how will people be able to see it in the virtual reality device that I saw it in?
Exactly. So that would be depend on the final distribution outfit. So let's say if you did a combination package between Facebook Watch and Oculus, which is the people that make these headsets that you saw them on, is owned by Facebook. So now you could see, for example, the two-dimensional series itself playing on Facebook and then going directly to Oculus's site, and you have your goggles on, you can watch it that way. Otherwise, through National Geographic or other means, that virtual reality footage will also be released.
Well, when I had that device on and I looked down and behind me, you were right behind me, climbing up with your crampons on this ladder and jabbing me with something like a ski pole.
That's right, because when you're watching that footage, you're actually seeing me climbing the mountain. So it's not an avatar or some computer-generated image. It's actually me that you're watching, so you can look down at my feet. You can see my hands moving. You can see the techniques that I'm using to climb the mountain and so on. And, so it my idea was to put you there, to actually put you there with a physical person, so you don't feel like you're just in a computer-generated environment.
All right, regarding the people who have died this year and in recent years past because of overcrowding, the peak is 29,000 feet. The base camp below it is 27,000 feet.
So you have 4 camps. You have 4 places that you go to during those rotations, right? So you have base camp at 17.5, and you'll spend most of your time there over the course of the 43 days that I was there. Then you have camp 1, that's 19.7. Then you have camp 2 at 21.3. Camp 3, which is on the steep wall of ice called the Lhotse Face. That's halfway between camp 2 and camp 4. That's 23.5, 23.7, depending on where you dig into the ledge there. And then camp 4 is 26,000 feet, and that's the final staging area, and that's in the death zone, as it's well known. That you have to be up there, or you can't be up there for more than a couple of days, no matter if you're on supplemental oxygen or not. Otherwise, you're not going to make it back down.
Wouldn't it be safer on the Nepal side, because there's a China side of it as well?
Correct.
All the tourists are coming up on, I shouldn't say tourists, there's some serious mountain climbers,
sure.
and some very not serious mountain climbers. I'll talk about some of them later. Wouldn't it be safer if they just put a chairlift there to the top from the very, very base in Nepal?
You know what? And it's funny because I interviewed a person there about that, not about the chairlift thing, but about the dangers of the icefall, which is one of the deadliest spots of the mountain and one that you can't avoid, right? So ideally, a chairlift over the icefall would be great. And we kind of joked about it, and I wouldn't be surprised if it could be done that someone would think about doing something like that.
All right. As far as the economics are concerned, Nepal makes about $300 million a year. Is that correct?
Yes, on climbing and trekking tourism. Yeah, correct.
And then there are some ancillary elements of it. It's a huge boom for the entire economy of Nepal. Now, $300 million doesn't sound like a lot of money in the context of the United States.
Yes.
But the gross domestic product of the country of Nepal is only Was it $1
billion probably?
$billion?
Yeah, I think so.
$1 billion, and this is $300 million.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm not even sure if it was 1 million. And let's say, for argument's sake, it was $1 billion. I'm going to look that up in a few moments. I'm wondering whether it was that high. The United States GDP is $20 trillion. 20 trillion. 20 trillion is the equivalent of 250 million billion or something like that. Anyway, I'll get my zeros worked out here in a second. This is huge for the country of Nepal, and they're not going to give that up, to say nothing of all the jobs associated with it.
Absolutely. And you're also talking about where Mount Everest lays is in the Khumbu Valley. It's the dead end of the Khumbu Valley. And so for about 4 months of the year, 2 months before the monsoons in the spring, 2 months the post-monsoons in the fall, the Khumbu Valley is one of the richest areas of Nepal because of that tourism that goes there to want to see Mount Everest Base Camp or to do the trekking around those famous peaks like Amada Blam and so on. So, yeah, you can imagine the jobs. You can imagine the airline tickets and the helicopter ticket flights and the lodging and the restaurants and all the activities that are related to the outdoors. So, yeah, it's quite significant that if you were to limit Mount Everest in general, access-wise, it would have a huge impact on the Khumbu Valley for sure, and also to the nation in general.
I just looked online. The gross domestic product of Nepal is $24 billion.
Okay.
Compared to
20
trillion dollars, which is 20,000 million. Anyway, it's more.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
So this is big bucks for them. And then when you look at all the associated revenue that comes into the country too. So they're under some pressure to cut back on the number of people who get permits, but they're not likely to respond to that pressure, are they?
No, they'll make gestures every other year about it, but at the end of the day, I don't think they're going to cut back on the permits. The Chinese have. The Chinese have done quite a bit of, quote unquote limiting, but they've always had a cap that's never really been, exceeded. And the Chinese don't care so much about Everest as the Nepalese do, especially from an economic standpoint. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. And there's also some other, regulation that they're looking to do with regards to Everest. But at the end of the day, we shall see, and I'm not too optimistic about it, to be honest with you.
All right, we're going to take our bottom of the hour break. When we come back, let's talk a little more specifically about what it's like and how dangerous it is to be stuck waiting in line for the ascent and then coming down for the descent. And you can fill us in on that, having done both of those. In the meantime, Susan, you've been to Everest, haven't you?
I have not been to it, but my son has. My son hiked to a base camp just about a couple months ago.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting. How did you like it?
He loved it. He said it was one of the hardest things he's ever done. He lives in Chicago, but he comes to Colorado all the time and hikes 14ers. He said it was absolutely amazing and wonderful and gorgeous. It was long before everybody got there. No crowds. He said there were a lot of people, but there weren't like which we have going on now with all those crowds and everything. But it was a life experience.
Mike Rosen back with you, filling in for Mandy Connell this week. She'll be back on Monday. Alex Hartz is our guest, who has climbed and filmed the ascent to the very peak of Mount Everest. For the last segment, for 20 minutes, Alex told you all about his expedition and some of the details and dangers and rewards, I should add, of this kind of an expedition. We've had a number of deaths in recent years. Most recently, a Boulder attorney, Christopher Coolidge, died on his way down from the summit. You've got people stacking up online now in rarefied air, where you've got a limited time you can even survive with oxygen as a support. And there's pressure now being placed on the government of Nepal to limit the number of permits that they issue for people to make this ascent. And they control it, at least on the Nepal side of the mountain. There's a China side of the mountain too, and I don't know, you didn't consider going up on the China side, did you?
No, for some logistical reasons I didn't.
Yeah,
no.
Okay. So here's an interesting account of this. Michael Kotis is an author who's written about this. He had a piece in the Washington Post just the other day, and he talked about people who freeze to death. Mm-hmm. While 40 other climbers step past the body of that person so as not to be deterred, since, as you indicated before, there's limited time. And there's a debate over how much effort can be expended on rescuing people near the summit without risking more deaths of people who don't need rescuing Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're on a finite amount of time and bottled oxygen typically. So depending on how much oxygen you have per minute flowing into your actual regulator in your mask will dictate how long each bottle of oxygen lasts, right? And at the end of the day, the first thing that happens is your core temperature starts to drop significantly because you're hypoxic. Even with the supplemental oxygen, you're hypoxic. You know, you got 7% by volume up there at that altitude versus, 21%, so it's a significant drop in the amount of oxygen in your system. So if you get to a situation where someone, needs to be helped, no one's going to carry anybody down. They can assist with short roping and using some different techniques, but at the end of the day, you still got to put one foot over the other. No one's going to carry you down like a fireman, for example. So if you can't come down, on your own accord, to the most part, you're not going to come down ever. And so when the oxygen levels start to run low and you're in a situation where, you're going to be low on the oxygen levels, you either have to turn around and, call it off, or you're going to have to say, all right, I'm going to deal with what I'm going to deal with right in front of me. But that's not usually a good option. And so the problem, though, is that you have a lot of operators now on Everest that didn't exist, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago that are running more low-cost expeditions. And what that does is it doesn't allow for the right amount of logistical support, staff expertise. They don't vet the climbers as well, like how skilled and experienced are the climbers, language barriers, and any kind of obligation to turn climbers around. Normally it's the obligation of the tour operator to say, you know what, I recognize things are going bad, we're going to turn around. But that oftentimes is not the case because it's to the summit at all costs versus turning people around. And there's other aspects that come into that, tips, getting bonuses for helping a climber get to the summit and these kind of things. So there's a lot of factors that come into play for this, but ultimately it leads to a bad situation if you're caught up in it.
I know you're familiar with Russell Bryce. We discussed this earlier, and he's one who puts together expeditions of people who want to go up, and they're not all prepared as you were, training heavily for a year. For example, he's had a 71-year-old Japanese man seek to go to the peak, an asthmatic, a New Zealand mountaineer who had lost both his legs to frostbite, would be, so to speak, climbing the mountain. What do you know of Mr. Bryson, the kind of thing he does?
Well, Russell, I interviewed him extensively, actually, and I've gotten to know Russell, not too bad. I think his operation, he's been there now. This is his 37th season to Everest, so he's one of the original guys. He's an iconic guy for leading expeditions to Everest, and he's been involved. For example, what you're reading there was from a TV show. It's called on Discovery Channel called Everest Beyond the Limit. That Russell Bryce was, the logistical driving force behind it. He runs a pretty tight ship, and he's the kind of guy that makes the call when the call is made. It's final, right? But what you see again, like I was mentioning earlier with some of the other operators, that doesn't happen. For example, if the climber says no, I want to keep going, there's descent in the ranks at those altitudes at times, and then there's no obligation by his climbing assistant or Sherpa to say, okay, I'm going to turn him around. Where Russell Bryce's situation is, it's not going to be that way.
That Brit I talked about, his name is David Sharp. He froze to death while other climbers walked past him. In fact, it was Bryce who had ordered the people in his party not to do anything to try to come to the aid of Bryce during their descent, and to move on rather than risk their own lives attempting a rescue he believed would be futile.
Yeah, they thought that Sharp was pretty much gone at the time. And that comes from, recognizing the situation from experience. And so then you're saying, okay, am I going to give up, for example, our resources, give up our oxygen to potentially try to save someone that's not going to be able to be saved? And so the call was made by a lot of teams, at that time when Sharp went down, that, okay, he's in a position where we're not going to be able to save him. He's too far gone, and it's just going to put our, team in jeopardy potentially.
When you talked about an accelerated consumption of oxygen, whether you're trying to climb Everest or scuba diving, if you have a lot of anxiety, if you're nervous, you're going to breathe much more heavily, and you're going to consume your oxygen faster. I'm picturing 20 or 30 or more people, either on the ascent or descent to Everest, who are having to wait in line, especially in the descent when they want to come down. They've been to the peak, they've had their experience, now they want to live to tell the tale. consuming ever more oxygen because they're having a panic attack on the way down, and suddenly this turns into a riot where people don't want to wait in line if they think that another 10 minutes is going to kill them.
Well, the thing is, the moving is slow up there, even under the best of conditions. You know, I was fortunate because I had the whole upper mountain to myself, along with only one other person. I was on the summit by myself with one other person for 45 minutes, so I was quite fortunate from that standpoint. But, you know, what happens is the moving is very slow to begin with, and it's also very confined in certain areas. So when you have congestion, for example, that built up this year in various spots, then all of a sudden you can't really turn around and you can't really go forward either. So it's a dicey situation. And in this year, it was really a combination of three factors that led to what happened, or that you're seeing across all the media. The first factor is you had a cyclone earlier in the month, May 2nd to the 4th. A cyclone Fani hit India and pushed up bad weather into the Himalayas and dumped a lot of wind and a lot of bad snow on Everest. And what that did is it delayed those earlier climbing rotations that we talked about, you know, where you go up the mountain to acclimatize. So that delayed that. It also started putting seeds of doubt into people's heads on whether or not there's going to be enough good summit weather windows later on in the month in order to make it to the top. And it also disrupted the jet stream, because the jet stream thereafter that flies over the summit of Everest, and the summit push is dependent on where it's located, was very fickle, was very unstable, and very unpredictable. And so because of that, it pushed the actual first summits later on in the season than normal, and the amount of summit windows that were predicted by the weather experts were very few, and they could only guarantee one really good block, and that was May 22nd to the 24th. So when you combine a ton of climbers, a lot of them that are anxious, like you talked about, and you can combine those with the forces of not knowing if there's going to be good weather for enough days to get people up there, you had a lot of people getting summit fever and a lot of people out of necessity saying, we've got to go. And so a lot of people went at the same time. Primarily the 22nd was the worst day, but the 22nd to the 24th. And then what happens in that situation is you're going to get yourself into a traffic jam if you're there at the wrong time.
Here's another account that was in the New York Times about somebody's personal experience. Climbers were pushing and shoving to take selfies. This is from the summit. Mm-hmm. The flat part of the summit, which was estimated at about the size of 2 ping pong tables, was packed with 15 to 20 people. To get up there, he had to wait hours in line, chest to chest, one puffy jacket after the next, on an icy, rocky ridge with a 7,000-foot drop. He even had to step around the body of a woman who had just died. It was scary, he said, by telephone from Kathmandu, Nepal, where he was resting in a hotel room. It was like a zoo.
Yeah, that was the 22nd.
Does that sound like an exaggeration, or do you think that was accurate?
Again, depending on the day you went up there. You know, and when you have a lot of people going for the same day or the same 2 days because they don't see there's going to be another weather window open up before the end of the season, you know, then that can happen. And again, a lot of that is driven by, you know, the operators. You know, I know, for example, some of my friends that run some companies over there, they waited a day. They said, okay, we know there's too many people going, and there's some teams that we don't want to be around that are going to be going. And so they waited a day. And of course, that was a good decision on their behalf.
According to Sherpas and climbers, this is another account, some of the deaths this year were caused by people getting held up in the long lines on the last 1,000 feet or so of the climb, unable to get up and down fast enough to replenish their oxygen supply. Others are simply not fit enough to be on the mountain in the first place. Some climbers did not even know how to put on a pair of crampons, clip-on spikes that increase traction on ice, according to the Sherpas. Nepal has no strict rules about who can climb Everest, and veteran climbers say it's a recipe for disaster. Alan Arnett, a prominent Everest chronicler and climber, you may be familiar with him.
I do know Alan, yes.
You have to qualify to do the Ironman, he said, but you don't have to qualify to climb the highest mountain in the world. What's wrong with this picture?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm, exactly, and that's because the Nepalese government wants to take those permits, and a lot of those low-cost operators are Nepalese-based, so of course you can see where that kind of becomes somewhat of a conflict of interest there.
What was it like back in the day when Sir Edmund Hillary climbed it in the early 1950s?
1953. Yeah.
Without the technology that we had today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's different. He didn't have fixed lines then. You know, when he climbed it with Tenzing Norgay, you know, they were just, you know, charting a brand new route, you know, trying to get to the top of the world. And they weren't the actual people set to go to the summit. They were more by default. But yeah, it was a different climb. And that was kind of interesting. And that's, again, where I was fortunate because I almost had that ability to see that experience because there was nobody there. And so when I'm looking up the same spot where you see the photos with the line there, it's called the Cornice Traverse and the Hillary Step. You see the people backed up there. There was no one there. And so I had the whole upper mountain to myself along with my buddy Tashi. And so I almost thought about that at times. Like, this must have been somewhat similar to a degree to what they must have felt to see this for the first time, because that was my first time up there as well.
Did Hillary have oxygen? Bottled oxygen?
Yes. Him and Tenzing both did. Yeah.
But he was a pioneer. He didn't have the experience of others getting to the summit.
Absolutely.
Presumably, no one had ever been to the summit of Mount Everest before him.
Yeah, exactly. And there was one account where someone may have made it, but not likely, but no one made it down. So yeah, so they were the first two to make it up and back down. And so yeah, it was totally uncharted territory, coming up from the Nepal side.
Tell me quickly, we've only got a few minutes left, about your pending Coors commercial. This is a great story.
Well, when I was there at Everest Base Camp, I actually brought a Coors Light can from Colorado, living here and knowing that Coors Light, has this branded campaigns about mountains, whatever your mountain is, climb on, altitude of refreshment, all these different campaigns. So I thought, while I'm there, why not shoot a Coors Light commercial? So I brought a Coors Light can with me.
Did it go all the way up to the summit?
No, I took it with me in my expedition boot, and we filmed a commercial with different variations at base camp. And, so now I'm going to approach Coors and see if they might be interested in that content. But I thought, whatever your mountain is, climb on, was their campaign. There's no better whatever your mountain is than climb on than Mount Everest. So
now, this was an audition commercial you did, right? It hasn't been broadcast yet.
Exactly. It hasn't been broadcast. It's rough footage right now.
So Coors might say in the future, instead of pure Rocky Mountain spring water, it's pure Mount Everest spring water.
Yes, it's Khumbu ice-fall water, yes.
Now, is your agency in contact with Coors, inviting them to have you endorse their product this way?
Yeah, they're in the process of doing that. Yeah.
What a great idea.
So, I figured I was there, so why not do it, And that was the idea behind it. I'm going to film all this stuff anyway for different reasons, but, thinking that this is what Coors, really kind of likes to brand with people as their mountain-themed images, and they had a great campaign going at the time. So I was like, let's take a can with me to ever see if it gets there and see if we can film a commercial during one of our rest days.
So when can we hope to see your documentary film?
Well, I'm hoping that we have something in the works to be released by this fall would be ideal. Again, I can't predict the future at this moment, but we'll see if it's the TV series and some ancillary documentary projects out of that as well. But we'll see, hopefully by the end of the season, that we'll have an answer for you.
Now, your expedition, you had Sherpas along with you.
Correct.
But I didn't see any of them in the reality video.
Yeah, because again, I was fortunate to have that whole upper mountain with only two people. One, I was climbing with my buddy Ryan, who was the expedition leader throughout the middle of the night going for the summit, and then with my buddy Tashi the rest of the way to the summit. So we were the only ones there.
Well, you've had a phenomenal life experience, and I hope all of this works out for you.
Well, I greatly appreciate that.
You deserve to be richly rewarded for this.
Well, I appreciate that, Mike, and that's the idea.
Alex Hartz, thank you.